I'm Gönül Tol. I'm the Director of Turkey Studies at the Middle East Institute. I'm very happy to welcome you to our panel discussion today. A lot is happening in Turkey, around Turkey. The latest is Turkey's military incursion into the northwestern Kurdish enclave of Aafrin. Turkey has been threatening a military operation for a year, but it seems that it finally got the green light from its partners on the ground. Of course, that will have important implications for the conflict in Syria, as well as Turkey's already strained relationship with the United States. Of course, we'll be talking about that and also talking about domestic politics and what we should expect from 2018. 2018 is a very critical year for Turkish domestic politics. The country will hold presidential and parliamentary and local elections in 2019. So it's important to keep an eye on what domestic actors are doing, what Erdogan's strategy is, whether there will be anyone who can challenge Erdogan in presidential elections in 2019. So we'll try to cover that and more. And we have a great panel of experts here. You have their bios, so I will briefly introduce them. To my left is my good friend Soner Çağatay. He is the director of the Turkish research program at the Washington Institute, and he is the author of a new book, a great book, The New Sultan, Erdogan and the Crisis of Modern Turkey. To my right is Howard. He is a non-resident senior fellow at Project on Middle East Democracy, and he's also an associate professor at Middle East History at St. Lawrence University. He served for over a decade as a Turkey country specialist for Amnesty International USA. And to his right is Max. Max Hoffman is the Associate Director of National Security and International Policy at Center for American Progress. He focuses on Turkey and Kurdish affairs. Prior to joining CAP, he worked on security issues for the United Nations and for the U.S. House of Representatives Armed Services Committee. So I'm greatly looking forward to today's talk. We are live streaming and recording this discussion for posting on the MEI website, so please silence your cell phones and feel free to tweet. Use the hashtag MEI Turkey. And also, before we begin, I want to call your attention to our expansion campaign, which is our largest ever fundraising effort. So if you haven't done so already, please pick up a pledge card at the front desk on your way out and consider a contribution to our growth. So now please join me in welcoming our panel. Of course, we'll start with the Aafrin Operation, and I want to start with you, Max. According to Turkish officials, the aim of the operation is first ensuring Turkey's border security, countering U.S. support for the Kurdish militia, the YPG, and blocking the YPG from reaching the Mediterranean. And also Turkish officials have been talking about establishing a 19-mile zone inside Syria in order to bring, quote, peace and stability to the region and build democratic institutions. Well, there is no U.S. presence in Aafrin, and I think at the moment it's practically almost impossible for the YPG to reach the Mediterranean. Bringing peace and stability, I think Aafrin has been one of the relatively few places where there's actually stability. So do you think, was this operation, and that question could land me in jail in Turkey, by the way. Several colleagues of mine were arrested 2 days ago because they said no to war. But so was this operation absolutely necessary, you think, from the Turkish perspective?
Well, thank you, Gönül, and thank you to all of you for being here and to the Middle East Institute for hosting. No, I don't think the Aafrin operation was necessary from my understanding of the situation in northern Syria. What has been the problem for some time is that the understanding here in Washington and certainly in the US government has been dramatically different from the understanding in Ankara and within the Turkish government. I think that notwithstanding the public comments from Turkish officials, there are three main reasons why they are conducting this operation in Aafrin. The first is a reason that they have alluded to extensively, and that's the counterterrorism imperative. Turkey, I think, does have some legitimate concerns about the potential for the Syrian Kurdish controlled areas in northern Syria to be the base from which PKK terrorists operate or supply their colleagues operating within Turkey. However, I do not think that this operation will help that situation at all from the Turkish perspective. They have replaced a steady border that they could patrol, along which they had built a wall, and they had extensive border security with a very fluid military situation in Afrin. They've dramatically inflamed Kurdish sentiment against Turkey, not just in Afrin, but across northern Syria and within Turkey itself, of course. And they're going to rely in the aftermath of this operation, if it is successful, on a light Turkish military presence and then Turkish-backed rebel groups, which are far from professional and are not, well drilled in counterterrorism operations or stability operations. So I think actually this is likely to worsen the threat of terror emanating from Afrin. That said, that first reason I think is the least important of three reasons. The second one is Turkey's desire to maneuver towards a stronger bargaining position vis-a-vis the Russians and the Syrian regime as all of the parties to the Syrian war move towards not yet de-escalation, but looking to de-escalate and build a post-war Syria. This is about the balance of power in those negotiations moving forward. I think that the Turkish move, clearly this was worked out with the Russians. Turkish aircraft have used airspace that the Russians control with their air defense systems. The Russians pulled their observers out in advance. I think this was basically a trade with the Russians and not so much the regime about Turkish-backed rebels in Idlib. Essentially carte blanche for Turkey and Afrin in exchange for Turkey withdrawing support for rebels in Idlib province.
So you're assuming that by having a military presence that Turkey will have a stronger hand vis-a-vis Russia and the regime. So you're assuming that the Turkish troops and Turkey-backed troops will remain in Afrin. Is that?
I think that, it's very uncertain, of course. This is going to be, if Turkey continues this campaign, it's likely to be bloody, it's likely to be slow. The YPG are reasonably well armed, they're well entrenched in Afrin, and by all reports, they enjoy extensive support in Afrin. They can still be supplied through Syrian regime-controlled territory, so they're not cut off. They, I think, are going to fight. We've already seen that in the initial days that the YPG mean to fight. That said, it's a NATO military. Turkey's deployed Leopard tanks, heavy artillery, F-16s, helicopters. I think eventually, if Turkey is determined, they will succeed in this offensive, but the costs will be high in terms of both casualties for the Turks, certainly for the Kurds, and most importantly, in many ways, for the civilians living in Afrin. Turkey's move will weaken the Kurdish position overall in Syria. They will, if this goes forward, they will lose one canton. The YPG in Afrin will likely turn to the Syrian regime for support, so they're pushing the YPG closer to the regime in many ways, which does not benefit the Turks, but they are weakening the Kurdish position. I think that's the thinking. But I believe there was a trade between the Russians and the Turks regarding Idlib, and that was one of the sparks for this move. The third reason the Turks are doing this, and I think, and I'm sure we'll get into this in greater depth, in many ways the most important reason, is domestic politics. The country is scheduled...
The domestic politics.
Domestic politics, sorry. The country is scheduled to have elections in 2019. I think probably others on this panel share my suspicion that those elections may be moved forward. July 15th, the anniversary of the coup attempt, falls on a Sunday this year. I believe Erdogan may move up elections and call them then. In any event, whether they're 2019 or this year, he is bent on shoring up national support within Turkey. It's crucial to his electoral ambitions. And this operation, in many ways, fits that paradigm as well.
Well, we'll come back to Turkish domestic politics, but Howard, I want to ask you the point that Max made. Kurds will be weakened, and of course that's a major concern for the U.S. The recently announced U.S. strategy, because the U.S. said that we decided to stay longer in Syria to stabilize and to build institutions, and of course the only partner that the U.S. have on the ground is the Kurds. So that's a major concern, and maybe that's why Americans have been quite soft on Turkey after the Aafrin Operation. They're trying to ease the tension. So I think my question is, and just this morning we heard that U.S. is trying to, of course the key for the U.S. is another Syrian town, which is called Manbij. So initially, right after the Aafrin Operation, Americans said Afrin is Russia's problem. There are Russian troops there. We don't have a presence there. What they're more concerned about is Manbij, and there are American troops there, and Erdogan threatened a military incursion into Afrin, into Manbij after Afrin. So that could be the breaking point. And that's why Americans are trying to offer a middle ground to Erdogan. Just this morning, we've heard that Secretary Tillerson offered a safe zone to the Turks. So my question is, what leverage does the U.S. have? What does that mean? What does that safe zone mean? Safe zone where?
Well, I don't think that anybody at this table or indeed many people elsewhere know exactly what it means. I guess I'd like to start out by pushing back a little bit on Max's reading of this, because I do think that there are long-standing security assumptions about the importance of preventing a Kurdish state or statelet on Turkey's borders. I think that Turkey was able to come to terms with the KRG over the years. The YPG, because of its association with the PKK, is an entirely different thing. I think that there are real concerns there, and I see no reason to believe that the current AKP government doesn't share sort of these long-standing assumptions about the dangers of a Kurdish state or statelet on its borders. I think that, in a sense, Turkey, faced with some very bad options, given both its weak position in Syria and the relationship of the YPG to the United States, effectively chose someplace where it felt that it could act with relative impunity. And it seems that they were right. It seems that the United States, having signaled that it would be unhelpful and all that the United States effectively acquiesced to Turkey moving against Afrin. As you say, though, Manbij is a completely different issue. It's at the core of the U.S. strategy regarding Syria. There's a lot of investment of material, and there's actually U.S. personnel there. It seems that the signaling right now is, okay, we understand that from the United States perspective, we understand that Afrin's effectively a done deal. You've acted. Whether we wanted you to or not, there's no way that we can roll that back. But we want to make a hard line between what you're doing in Afrin and extending it further. Whether that's doable or not is unclear to me. Whether the United States is signaling that effectively is unclear to me, and whether Turkey is receiving those signals completely is unclear to me. And so my concern is that there is effectively a line for the U.S. On Manbij, but it's not clear to me whether that line has been effectively communicated between them. The last point I'd make is that we know very little about, other than that they are currently fighting in Afrin, we know very little about the YPG's larger strategy. How many troops are they willing to move out of Manbij into Afrin? What would their response be to a long-standing Turkish presence there? And again, it's not clear to me what the United States is communicating and how effective that communication is. Effectively, if the United States is not going to attach repercussions to its concerns and make those repercussions high enough and clear enough, it's unlikely to be listened to.
But maybe, Soner, I should ask you this. Do you think there will be a military confrontation if Turkey decides to attack Manbij? To NATO allies, there's a high risk of a military conflict between the two NATO allies. So do you think, would Erdogan take that risk?
So probably not, but before that, I also wanted to thank you, Gönül, for inviting me. It's a great panel. I'm also very happy to be together with two good friends and colleagues, Max and Howard. We do a lot of fun things together, and I should also say that I've known Howard for many years now. We did our PhDs back in our prospective home institutes. That's where we met, and I'm glad to say that we've stayed in touch, including in the amount of hair we have, so, or we don't have. So really an awesome panel. Thanks for setting it up. I think my views on Aafrin are slightly diverge from conventional wisdom at the moment. I think that it's actually a master stroke for Erdogan. I'll explain in a minute, which is why I think he won't, although he's upping the ante on Manbij in terms of rhetoric, I don't think he's going to go for that, for escalation yet. And here's why. YPG, which is an offshoot of the PKK or a close subsidiary, is organized among Kurds all over Syria, but the US has relationship with the YPG in Syria in all areas except for Aafrin, which means, and I'm throwing alphabet soup, but it's really important to highlight. Outside of Aafrin, US cooperation with the YPG falls under what is called Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, and outside of Aafrin, YPG is a tactical US ally, but not in Aafrin, where there is no SDF. And I think that's why it's a masterstroke for Erdogan, because he isolated YPG to the only area where it is not a US ally and targeted it, so that does not put him in a collision course necessarily with the US. He also forced the YPG's Aafrin protector, which is Russia, to decide to pick between YPG or Ankara. Obviously, Putin picked Ankara. And I think this is therefore really cornering the YPG in that enclave. So the reason why I think it was a masterstroke is because it was his ability, Turkey's ability, to isolate the broader YPG from the YPG in Aafrin, YPG from SDF, YPG from the US, and target the only YPG that's not US ally. And I think going forward, of course, Aafrin, if it succeeds, it's a masterstroke militarily. I think the Turkish vision is not necessarily to take Aafrin city itself. Now, in this enclave, there's a city called Aafrin, homonymous. It's where bulk of the population lives. The rest of the area is mostly sparsely populated, and I think that's the security belt Turkey wants to take over. It won't necessarily take over large civilian population. Of course, there will be fighting. And so if it succeeds, I think the idea is that parts of Aafrin would remain in the hands of YPG, mainly the city, and the sparsely populated rural areas would become part of a Turkish security zone. So it would be a slight expansion of Turkish territorial sphere of influence inside Syria, together with the Jarablus pocket, maybe.
But is it possible? I know all the major parties, Russia gave the green light, and that's how Turkey could be able to launch this attack. And Iran, although condemned did not condemn the attack, basically asked Turkey to halt the operations, but fall short of directly condemning. And the Assad regime, I think, quietly accepted it. And because all these parties, they are very concerned about long-term US presence. So they see Turkey's Aafrin operation as a way to weaken American partners, the YPG. And I think that's why they agreed with the operation. But I don't think none of these actors will agree to a long-term Turkish presence. So I think, and please let me know what you think. I think the next step in Aafrin is going to be whatever Turkey and Turkish-backed forces capture will be handed over to the regime. I think that's a more likely scenario.
Look, in the long term, the regime wins. Right? It's in the long term, we know that the United States may keep a handful of forces and can cooperate with the YPG for a time to keep a line in the water. But its primary concern, it has a secondary concern about Iran, but its primary concern is ISIS. ISIS is, metastasizing into something else. In the long term, it's clear that the YPG will eventually come to some sort of deal with the regime, that the regime will eventually extend control, and then Turkey has no reason to be there. I mean, in other words, I don't think that's the concern. I think the concern is effectively, and it goes back to your initial question about the United States and Turkey, whether an accident happens, a miscalculation happens along the way that creates a larger crisis between the two allies that sort of shifts the focus. In the long term, I think we know that the Assad regime is going to come out on top.
But just a minor point is, I understand what you're saying, but on the other hand, wouldn't that put Turkey in a very awkward position? There are already at least 3 Turkish soldiers killed in the Aafrin Operation. So imagine that Turkey handing over the territory that the Turkish soldiers died for to the regime. And just a month ago, Erdogan called Assad a terrorist. We know that Turkey quietly dropped its opposition to the regime, but in rhetoric, Erdogan is still fiercely anti-Assad. So what do you think, Max?
I would push back on Soner's conception of this as a master stroke for Erdogan. Yes, he has managed to isolate the Aafrin YPG. He sets the stage for, he's upped the pressure on the United States to measure or temper its support for the YPG that are working with us in the or with the United States in the SDF. But there are tremendous risks here. First, it's very, very questionable whether he'll be able to isolate the Aafrin conflict from a broader Kurdish-Turkish conflict across northern Syria. Manbij, again, is the flashpoint there. All it takes, again, Afrin is not an isolated place. There are still, you can get supplies in through regime-controlled territory. The Syrian regime has every motive to try and make this as painful as possible for the Turks. They're very likely to provide whatever support, whether it be arms, supplies, intelligence to the YPG that they're able. I think the Russians are playing a double game. Yes, they are likely to play a double game. Yes, they cut a deal with Turkey to allow them to do this operation, but they don't want Turkey's hands strengthened any more than the regime does. There's also, in addition to Manbij and the threat that Erdogan is true to his word and continues this offensive and moves on Manbij, in which case U.S. Special Forces will be caught in the middle. Mm-hmm. There's also the unintentional risk of escalation. The SDF branch of the YPG has been provided with U.S. anti-tank missiles. All it takes is one of those missiles being used against a Turkish Leopard tank in Afrin for us to be in a whole new environment. Or Turkey is launching raids with F-16s. They're shelling YPG positions, not just in Afrin. All it takes is a miscalculation there or an intentional accident, if you will, and a U.S. soldier caught in the crossfire, again, to dramatically change the political calculus for the leadership here. And we're in a whole new situation. The other thing I'd say is that, even if this offensive goes well, the regime will be strengthened. The Syrian regime's motive to hurt Turkey will not go away. They blame Turkey for the civil war, for supporting the rebels. And even in a post-war de-escalated setting, they're likely to covertly do whatever they can to increase costs on Turkey. Lastly, again, you don't see the end point here. Even if the Turkish-backed rebels and Turkish forces sweep through Afrin, the YPG is not as strong as we all anticipate. They're then left holding and securing this territory with a whole array of hostile actors with the ability and the motive to hurt them at the doorstep. I've traveled, we've traveled in southeastern Turkey. Along the border there, every 150 meters, 200 meters, there are Turkish armored cars with Turkish soldiers guarding the border. Those are all potential targets for Kurdish insurgents from either side of the border. And the Turkish military is very overextended, particularly in the wake of the coup attempt, which took out half the senior leadership. They have deployments in northern Iraq. They have a very serious PKK insurgency in southeastern Turkey. They have observation points in Idlib. They have this Aafrin operation, and they're still operating in the Euphrates Shield safe zone between Jarablus and Azaz. So, there are a lot of risks here. I think it's far too early to say it was a masterstroke.
And also, I think on Russia's maybe, and also Russia, yes, Russia, I think, wanted to teach the Kurds a lesson after this 30,000 strong border force announcement. So they're trying to weaken the Kurds to curb US influence and to signal to the Kurds that actually Russia calls the shots. But I don't think they want to weaken. They don't want to completely destroy the Kurds either. So at some point, I think the Russians will still invite the Syrian Kurdish militia to the diplomatic talks, and that will really test the limits of Turkey-US partnership here.
Correct. So just tag on that, and I'll take Max's pushback and pushback in return.
I'd be disappointed if you didn't.
I think it's a masterstroke if it succeeds militarily, of course. We haven't seen the full military success. But because of the way it's conceived strategically, it's a masterstroke. While YPG is a U.S. ally, I think some of the initial coverage of the Aafrin Operation was saying, Turkey is targeting U.S. ally. YPG and Aafrin is not U.S. ally. As far as the U.S. government is concerned, they're Russia's people. They're not America's people. What Turkey is doing is not targeting U.S. allies, although it's the same organization because it's so geographically split into these enclaves. And I think that's why it's a masterstroke, because Erdogan or Ankara is not pushing back against the U.S. as the U.S. sees it. Number two, he's forcing Russia to give him some love in Aafrin, saying, who are you going to pick, us or the YPG? And third, it's weakening the YPG. This group was on the cusp of being invited to Sochi and Geneva because it was rising, and now it's being rolled back. If it's defeated militarily, it will be seen as a weak actor in Syria, not someone who deserves an automatic invitation to next round of talks at Sochi or Astana or Geneva, wherever they're held. And I think for those reasons, this is a pretty crafty strategic move. On the Russia part, I agree with my colleagues in Gönül. If you go to Vegas to gamble, people say the house always wins. In Syria, Russia always wins. At the end, it doesn't matter what happens. This is because the Russians play a very strategic, masterful game in the north, where I follow more closely, but in the south as well. The Russians give everybody a little bit of what they want, but never everybody everything that they want. So everybody always is Russia's security client because they get a bit of what they want, but not everything. So yes, they'll give Turkey a bit of what they want. Turkey wants part of Aafrin, but not all of Aafrin. They'll tell the YPG, look, we had to do this, and they'll tell the regime, you can take over some of these territories later on. I think that the regime will also win because that's Russia winning. One of the reasons why I think the Assad regime vacated Kurdish majority areas of the country was intentional. He knew that he could patch up the rest of the country, and if it came back to taking over Kurdish areas, nobody's going to tell him, oh, please don't take over the Kurdish areas. So he knows that this is the last piece of Syria that he has to puzzle back together. If he has taken over pretty much all of the country, he could easily move into the Kurdish areas. And I think the YPG's ultimate enemy is going to be the Assad regime. It's not Turkey. And I think that's, of course, when the Russians will probably double deal with everybody again. So this could be, in my view, the beginning of the collapse of Rojava if the YPG overextends. For example, we spoke about Manbij and other areas. If the group decides to target Turkey from Manbij or eastern Syria, it will be targeting a NATO ally. At this stage, it will be very difficult for United States, Turkey, or Turkey's NATO allies to say yes to what is happening. And I think you could see Rojava being rolled back, not unsimilar to the way the KRG was rolled back last year in Iraq. So perhaps this could be the beginning of a dramatic set of events. We're not there yet. But I can see how the YPG could be tempted to take the battle outside of Aafrin. And if they do, I think they'll lose.
And I will ask the most difficult question to you, Howard. So if the U.S., we've been saying that Manbij is going to be the key, and the U.S. will be forced to pick a side. So What would be the choice?
That I don't know is disturbing. My fear is that the United States hasn't decided yet, and my even bigger fear is that Turkey doesn't know. And I think that the lack of clarity raises the capacity for mistakes. Turkey's not an irrational actor. It chose its target here reasonably. It escalated and then de-escalated a crisis with Russia. It escalated and now is de-escalating a crisis with Germany. It's capable of shifting. And I think that one of the reasons why the relationship with between Turkey and the United States has gotten as bad as it has is because the repercussions of stymieing the United States have not been clear, and I fear that continues to be the case. The other side of that, however, is that frustration with Turkey in Congress, within the bureaucracy, is at a level that I've never seen before, that I've never seen the like of before. And so I guess what I'm worried about is that Turkey misreads the United States. The United States doesn't make clear enough the repercussions, and then if something happens on that border, that the U.S. response is overwhelming and effectively breaks the relationship. It's a spiral out of small things that I really worry about.
I mean, everyone says that the U.S. faces a very difficult choice. On the one hand, what's at stake is its Syria policy. Without the Kurds, they don't have a Syria policy. On the other hand, there is the NATO ally. So I'm going to ask, and anyone on the panel can jump in. Is that the case? Is really, we always, whenever we talk about Turkey, we say, well, Turkey is a strategic U.S. ally, it's a NATO partner. But in practice, why is Turkey still valuable? And I know that there's a debate within the administration, and there's a group of people saying that, well, we already lost Turkey. They're purchasing S-400 from the Russians. There are just so many problems on the agenda. They're impossible to fix. So we already lost Turkey, and that's why. And we need the YPG. So what's your take on that?
You're right. There's a debate, and because there's a debate, it's in part because there's a debate that there's a lack of clarity. There's all sorts of ways in which U.S. foreign policy is, first of all, very conservative. We've had a longstanding relationship with Turkey. There's a lot of built-in infrastructure. There are still built-in relationships, apparently on sort of an operational bureaucratic level. Turkey and the United States have lots of ways where they work together well. At the same time, there's this laundry list of frustration on both sides. And I think there's a growing sense on both sides that we're allies in name only. I don't think that either side wants to lose the relationship, but I think with each new flashpoint, there's the possibility that one side or the other throw in the towel.
I agree entirely. Neither side can afford to have this relationship completely broken. I'm not convinced that the U.S. will be forced to choose between its support for the SDF portion, east of the Euphrates, and its relationship with Turkey, in an absolute sense. I still think that this muddled, sort of nobody's happy approach can continue to be managed. But the fate of that balancing act lies in Erdogan's hands. And Erdogan can certainly take actions that would force the United States to choose. those actions would include moving on Manbij, although even, it's not a given in my mind that a move on Manbij would automatically result in sort of the big choice, the end of the game, pick a side. Because the US could withdraw, it could orchestrate the withdrawal potentially of the YPG forces there, or the YPG forces there, and a face-saving arrangement could be worked out. And all parties not all parties, but the US and Turkey, and to some extent even the SDF, have an interest in avoiding an outright conflict, a wider conflict. So it's not clear to me that there will be a forced choice there in a dramatic sense. What is clear is Erdogan, his imperatives are driven by Turkey's mood and by his domestic needs. They are overwhelmingly, virulently nationalist right now, and nativist in many ways. We've just been running public opinion surveys and focus groups on questions of nationalism in Turkey, and the mood is, understandably, after 4 years of serious terrorism threats and security threats, and of course after more than 4 years of Erdogan's very conspiratorial, anti-Western sort of rhetoric of victimhood. The country is in a defensive crouch. It's inclined to lash out. It's inclined to go its own way. It's extremely angry at the United States and the West writ large. The United States has 10% approval in our poll in Turkey, and that's across parties. There's very little. It's not as if the Social Democrats are any happier with us than the AKP voters or the MHP. So Erdogan is responding to that. He's also been driving that for many years with his rhetoric. I mean, he has blamed every crisis to befall Turkey on his watch, on the United States or the West, even if it's been just implicit, from global interest rates to economic slowdown to Gezi Park to the coup to the December 1725 corruption allegations to the PKK to the PYD to ISIS in many ways, sort of hinting at that. I mean, it's unbelievable. Nothing's not the United States' fault. That plays very well to his constituents. It's driven also by the fact that the voting blocs in Turkey are relatively durable, or some of them are relatively durable. The Kurdish vote at about 11%, the religious conservative vote around 32%, or the AKP base, I should say. The Social Democrats at 25%. The swing votes, such as they are nationalists. They are conservative Turkish nationalists who may be less religious than the AKP base, but are inclined to vote for the AKP and Erdogan if they seem tough, if they play to their concerns. So a lot of the strategic picture in the U.S.-Turkish relationship rests in this one man's hands, and let us not forget, he believes that the coup attempt was orchestrated by the United States. He thinks the U.S. tried to kill him. And it's very important to keep that in mind. He won't admit it publicly, but I think it's sure. So, we can't be sure what he will do.
Well, he made a nice transition that leads me to my next question, Soner. I know you have something to add, but let me first ask my question. How big of a role did domestic politics play in the timing of the operation?
Definitely, I think part of domestic political scene, many analysts, including myself, are suggesting that Erdogan might be eyeing for snap elections this year. Turkish elections are not scheduled for until November 2019, so that's almost 2 years. But economy grew really strong last year, nearly 7%. Erdogan has a challenger coming up from the center-right, Akşener's İyi Party, Good Party. And he might want to nip her party in the bud before it really builds up, using the time advantage of the next 2 years, while she's still not polling above 10% in the polls. Turkey is a 10% electoral threshold, so right now might be the opportune moment to strike her out. And of course, the Aafrin Operation, if it succeeds, if the masterstroke delivers, it wouldn't be too different than what Cyprus was in 1970s for Ecevit. It's a major national victory, and of course Erdogan's complete domination of the media will help make that victory bigger than it is. So perhaps I think this is maybe another indicator that if this works out, snap elections might be in the offing. I also wanted to weigh in on your previous question on views of Turkey, and I think that most of the questions in Washington regarding Turkey are really about policies of the government, from democracy to purchase of S-400 missiles. But I also get the sense that from within the U.S. government that many people also believe, and aptly so, that Turkey is and remains and will be bigger than Erdogan. Here's what I mean by that. I mean, Erdogan controls Turkey with an iron fist. I often get this question whether Turkey is Russia. I say, well, Erdogan wants to be Putin, but Turkey is not Russia, and it will never be Russia. Putin has run Russia for an iron fist. He wins elections by 80%. Erdogan dominates the country, media, all the institutions. He still can win only 51%. That's pretty amazing, that after 15 years of complete domination of the political space, he can barely eke out a minor margin of victory. And the 49% that doesn't vote for him, that's 40 million people. That's the population of Spain. That's a very big Turkey that's out there. And I think people are, of course, seeing that. And I think the U.S. view will always be thinking and embracing the view of Turkey is bigger than Erdogan and remains as such. I think your other question on, and I agree with Max on this, on Turkey YPG, U.S. picking sides, I think it would be completely stupid for the YPG to force the U.S. to decide whether it will pick Turkey or YPG. There's no question that U.S. or its NATO allies will not pick the YPG. So I think that's why if the conflict escalates and is carried east of Afrin to other areas, if it becomes a border war between Turkey and YPG, there's no doubt in my head that U.S. and its NATO allies will come to Turkey's assistance. And I think the YPG is already internally weak. The problem is that when it started, the original cantons that the YPG controlled were overwhelmingly Kurdish. There's a problem there too. I mean, this is a totalitarian group. The YPG is Marxist. It doesn't like difference of opinions. So first of all, it has a problem of maintaining law and order among Kurdish majority areas, but assuming that it has some kind of loyalty enforced from the Kurds. Now, it controls large areas that are overwhelmingly not Kurdish, Raqqa, Derzor, and others. So it's completely weak, I think, internally, and it would fracture. I would say it could fall down like a house of cards if it went into a confrontation with Turkey very easily, both due to external but also internal reasons.
I just,
Go ahead.
I hear the reason why you would have utter confidence that in the end the United States will stand by its NATO ally rather than what's effectively a tactical ally. I don't have that confidence, though. I don't have that confidence because decision making isn't made on sort of a 10-year time frame. It's made with the concerns of the day. And I think that laundry list of frustrations has created a backdrop where at least some in the U.S. government don't believe that Turkey's already been lost, and therefore it's pointless to continue to work with them. And finally, I'm not convinced because I don't think that the United States government is working with one voice anymore. I think that there's clear divisions within the administration bureaucracy. I think that Congress is exerting itself in ways that it hasn't for many, many years. And I understand the logic of what you're suggesting. I just don't know that logic will win out in the end.
If I could just jump in on this question of Congress, because the event is, what does 2018 have in store for Turkey? And in light of the U.S.-Turkish tensions and where the relationship is going, even if there's a commitment to, I sort of agree with Soner that the U.S. will sort of choose Turkey if forced at some basic level to do so, though I don't think that will be such a clear-cut moment. But there are still a number of, I was sitting down and thinking, what are likely events in 2018 in this space and what are probable events before this event? Well, it's very likely that Turkey will be sanctioned by the United States on at least 2 fronts and possibly 3 fronts. I'm thinking of Halkbank, sanctions against Halkbank in light of the Attila conviction. I'm thinking of potential sanctions under the Russia sanctions for the S-400 purchase, although I've also been told that that would only take place when the system was delivered, which is scheduled for 2019, if it happens. And then there's the possibility that they're sanctioned under Global Magnitsky Act for Pastor Brunson's continued detention. So those are the ones we expect in the relationship, the sources of tension. And those are driven in, not exclusively, of course, OFAC controls the Attila decision, but driven in large part by Congress on the other fronts. So you're right, absolutely right, Howard, that Congress is asserting itself in this space, and much in the way that Erdogan is responding to the nationalist constituency and that imperative domestically on his side. You don't have to take many visits to the Hill to know how angry both parties are with Turkey.
But so let's just do a hypothetical. The United States draws a hard line on Manbij, and Turkey steps over it, either because they don't believe what the United States has said, or because it wasn't communicated forcefully enough. So the United States shrugs and says, well, you're our NATO allies, and in the long term, our obligations are to you. I don't know that that's true. And if we're all at this table confident that it is true, then Turkey has no reason to be listening to the United States on Manbij at all.
Well, I want to go back to what Soner said earlier, that Turkey is bigger than Erdogan. And my question to all of you is, what is left to counterbalance Erdogan? Turkey was an electoral democracy, but after the referendum, we're not even sure that's the case anymore. So what do you think? What is there to challenge? There are no institutions, no media, there's no independent bourgeoisie. There is not much left. So what do you think?
I think Soner's point that there is roughly half the country that is unhappy with Erdogan is absolutely true. I think there's also a percentage of AKP voters who, in the abstract, would like to have more choices. I don't think that those amount to a capacity to challenge, in part for the reasons that you suggested, the unfair media environment, the likelihood that there was some sort of ballot rigging in both the referendum and in municipal elections in 2014, but also the 10% barrier, which the AKP did not create, but has always served as a brake on Turkish democracy, in part because the opposition parties are largely weakly led. I don't think that Akşener is the great white hope that she is sometimes portrayed as. And the opposition has not been able to unify on really anything. They have not stood up. They did not stand up to the suppression of the HDP. They did not stand up to the politicization of the courts. They did not stand up in the end to the improprieties of the referendum. They have not attempted to draw a line anywhere, and have more or less conducted business as if Turkey still was an electoral democracy. I think that there is a base of opposition, but I don't think that opposition has shown the willingness to pick a fight.
Max, what do you think? Do elections still matter in Turkey?
What have I done to you, Gunil, to get that question? No. I'm going to argue with myself here for a minute. On the one hand, it's very difficult, hard to predict things in Turkey or anywhere these days. On the one hand, the polling is all over the place. Some of the polls show, so EE party under 10%, HDP under 10%, MHP under 10%. Showing EE basically breaking the opposition, because the result of that, if it were just CHP and AKP in parliament, would be a strengthened AKP majority. But some of them show show AKP weakened, show EE around 20%, show CHP at its usual level or close to it of 20, 24%. And then some polls further show HDP and MHP still sneaking in which case you've got a very, divided and open parliament. The big question, of course, is the presidential election, which will be held simultaneously for the first time. There, again, the polls are all over the place. But all of the polls, interestingly, or all of the reliable polls, show Erdogan under 50%, which means he'll face a runoff election. Further, some of those polls show Akşener extremely close to him. One of them with undecideds distributed show it as a 51-49 race. That's a long shot, right? I don't necessarily, but my point is, it's not, in an open election, there's a potential vulnerability there. And because of his Erdogan's moves to consolidate so many levers of state power in the office of the presidency under the new system, that would be a hugely decisive change were he to be knocked off, which is one of the reasons I don't think that's going to happen. I think he will do everything in his power. As you mentioned, the media
and he also changed the electoral law.
I was going to say, this is also going to be a very different election in many ways, not just the potential for split ticket voting for both parliament and presidency, but also the new electoral law where they have removed the parties' election box observers. So now all of the election box observers will be appointed by the state. I think that opens up the window for serious risk of meaningful voter fraud. The High Electoral Board and the High Board of Judges and Prosecutors are completely under Erdogan's thumb, and it's not a fair vote. But it'll also be electing 600 MPs as opposed to 550, which will be interesting to see. And there's no new electoral law. They're meant to pass one as part of the amendments to change the Constitution. They have not yet done so. So we just don't know. There are so many uncertainties. It's just very hard to see. You first need to hold Erdogan under 50%. You then need to make sure that the second place finisher is the most effective national candidate to challenge him, which is problematic given that the CHP is the second largest party and Kılıçdaroğlu has proven himself not to be that person. You then need the opposition to cooperate, and then you need to face down the most effective politician in Turkey's modern history in a one-on-one race. Those are a lot of ifs, and that's if it's all conducted fairly, which is the biggest if of all. So.
I'll just add one more. I agree with you. I think that it's clear that it's already an unfair environment, right? We're talking about sort of levels of unfairness beyond that, and it's not clear that Erdogan needs to cheat.
Right.
But counterfactually, I don't think that anybody in this room believes that if he lost a presidential election, that he'd simply pack up his bags and go back to Kasım Pasha. He's spent a decade building this infrastructure. He's created a system that will guarantee his power till, depending on your interpretations of the referendum, 2029 or 2034. He's not going to lose. It's not going to happen. We can bet the farm on it.
Well, I would. If you don't have anything to add, I'll go ahead and open the floor for questions from the audience. You've been very patient, so please wait. How many mics do we have? Yes, so please wait for the mics and introduce yourselves and try to ask a question, and please try to make it brief. So there is a question here and one there.
Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and a former diplomat. I note that if things go really badly for the Kurds in Aafrin, they'll try and make it to Manbij, and then suddenly they're U.S. allies. The question is, since Turkey's military infrastructure is so overwhelmingly American equipment, at what point do you sort of cut back on parts, tell General Dynamics not to take the phone calls anymore, stop sharing satellite imagery, call up Angela Merkel and tell her to stop sending Leopard parts, et cetera, et cetera? Do we need a couple dead Navy SEALs? Do we need 300 dead civilians? What's the threshold for cutting the actual military nitty-gritty?
So let's take two more questions.
Hi, my name is Mohammed Tahir from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Actually, I wanted to push back a little with all of the panelists here. about going back to the Aafrin question. You know, we heard a panel talking about, YPG being a U.S. ally, and at the same time, we also heard that this is offshoot of PKK, which is recognized as a terrorist organization by the United States. I know at the time of war and love, logic kind of takes back seat, but I kind of cannot comprehend how does this work. And also, second, led to that question is, U.S. is providing YPG weapons, and what's the guarantee that these weapons will not fall in the hands of people in Kandil? Or is it okay if it falls to people in Kandil?
Okay, one last question, Andrew, here. Please.
My name is Andrew Self. My question's for Howard. Howard, your recent piece, Uneasy Rest of Crown, you raised the issues of sort of the rise or the return of militias and paramilitaries and sort of these shadowy contractors employed by the state. In light of the upcoming elections, I wonder if you might comment on, are we going to see a return to political violence of the 70s in Turkey? And if so, if that's a parallel, the biggest difference seems to be that in that case, the left was armed. So what's the prospect for the left in this case?
Great. Who would like to start first?
Sonar hasn't spoken in a while.
I can definitely weigh in on whether there would be a rupture in U.S. Turkish and EU Turkish ties because of the escalation in Syria. I think it's highly unrealistic to expect Angela Merkel to call Erdogan and say, I won't send you any more spare parts for Leopard tanks. I think Erdogan actually knows that more so than the United States, the European Union is going to be completely quiet over Turkey policy in the next year or two. That has a lot to do with a variety of issues, from the refugee deal to the ability of Erdogan to mobilize Turkish communities, diaspora communities in Europe in his favor, and that's something the Germans and the others fret over. I think that he's got a lot to expect in terms of establishing better ties with the Germans and others than crisis. And German government has already said once they have a government, of course, Germany doesn't have a government. It's like the world has come to an end. Once they have a government, they'll, of course, reach out and they would like to have Merkel visit Turkey. And I think that you could expect an uptick in a relationship between Europe and Turkey. We already saw this with the case of Macron. Macron is leading Europe, in case you didn't realize. So he's also leading Europe's Turkey policy. He's reached out to Erdogan. He's hosted him in Paris. I think that's a sign of good things to come on Turkey-EU front. I'm similarly optimistic on the U.S. side. Yes, I think there are, various people from the Congress to CENTCOM, which are very critical of Turkey policy in general. But overall, I think I agree with what something Max said. It's such and Howard as well. It's such an old relationship. And Howard said we have so much infrastructure. That is true. Turkey is like somebody you knew from since 6th grade. And yes, you're in your 50s now, and they did something really terrible, but you're thinking about all the wonderful things you did for the last 50 years. So it's really hard to let that friendship go, and I think this is going to be the ultimate U.S. view, and I think the sooner the YPG internalizes this, the better it is for them, but I have a feeling they're going to want to push the envelope. And also, of course, one spoiler into this optimistic scenario I've thrown would be Russia, which ultimately wants to see a weakened Turkish-Western relationship, including a weaker Turkish commitment to NATO. I think that Russia's bigger game is not only that it wants a weak NATO, but it also wants a weak Turkey, because that means a weak NATO. So whether it is helping Erdogan's opposition or exacerbating Turkey's deep crisis, or helping, making things difficult for Turkey and U.S. in Syria, I think those are the areas we have to look where the Russians can complicate things.
There was a question about the YPG, the PKK.
You're not going to be satisfied because the answer is don't know, of course, the threshold on when you see steps like that from the United States. I would say that I'll get to that question in a moment. On the German front, that there are difficult coalition politics at stake in Germany, and Merkel left to her own devices, I think would pursue roughly that course on air. She may still, but she also has to appease, strongly sort of Turkey skeptical or even hostile voices from her potential coalition partners, and also just in the general context of German politics. So, Germany's already cut back military sales to Turkey by all reports. The other functional side of this relationship between the U.S. and Turkey is Incirlik. I think if there were one of those black swan events where someone gets caught in a crossfire in Syria, that sort of thing, Incirlik might be the first place you'd see that play out, with potentially the U.S. asked to leave Incirlik. But that's speculation, of course. To your question, absolutely. There's been a contradiction at the heart of the U.S.'s engagement with the YPG, PYD, SDF from the beginning. Because it was such a reluctant relationship that was entered into very quickly as the ISIS's attack on Kobani played out, the U.S. didn't do what I think it should have done, which was build a political relationship with clear conditions attached with the PYD. Say, yes, we want to support you in providing basic stability and security in your areas and in fighting ISIS, but here are the criteria under which this will happen. One of them is, you have to have a peaceful relationship with the Turks. That wasn't done because it was just all done in a hurry to beat ISIS, to stop that offensive, and to save Kobani. And then the political side was, I'd say, left playing catch-up, except there hasn't actually been much catch-up played. It's just been dormant. So this military relationship now is so well developed that CENTCOM and the Pentagon is unlikely to abandon it, but the political contradiction has never been resolved. I would say a few things to temper that. Yes, the YPG certainly has ties to the PKK. Yes, PKK fighters, fight with the YPG. I've been in Diyarbakir when you see, a dozen funerals in a week of Turkish Kurds killed fighting in Syria with the YPG. It's the social sort of fabric of that whole region is tied together, and the leftist Kurdish movement is dominant. Turkey doesn't like to admit that, but it's true. That said, these are different conditions than sort of Kandil or the PKK. This is a relatively diverse part of Syria where the YPG, and then increasingly when it did transition into something new as the SDF, there were Arab fighters and Assyrian fighters incorporated. It did change. They've had to maneuver this more complicated environment, and they've been under heavy pressure, genuine pressure from the United States to include non-Kurdish fighters in the militias, to include them in the governing councils. And I think the U.S. hope was that it could be a moderated influence and could guide these leftist Kurdish groups into a conciliatory direction vis-a-vis Turkey. They've had that job dramatically complicated by Turkish actions, I would say. But I'm not sure that effort is dead. I'm not sure it's completely failed. And in a de-escalated context, where the Euphrates is a peaceful dividing line, maybe the U.S. could manage that situation in a more positive direction, is all I'd say.
So, I mean, to sort of try to string things along, starting with Kobani, Turkey was making decisions as well. And in the end, Turkey saw, it had a choice in Kobani, and it decided that ISIS taking the city was less of a strategic risk than the YPG taking the city. The United States had different priorities, and both acted accordingly. I don't want to be too moralistic about this. There was a clear strategic priorities on both sides, and we came down on opposite sides of the fence. I think everybody in Washington recognizes how uncomfortable this is, just as everybody in Washington recognizes how uncomfortable it is that Fethullah Gulen is living comfortably in Pennsylvania. But decisions aren't made in a vacuum, and I think that goes to your point, which is that there are a lot of that Turkey gets a lot of benefit, and the United States has a lot of potential sticks that so far as I can tell, it has been very reticent to use. Now, some of those sticks cost us money and jobs, right? There's and I think that's true as well for Europe. We would like to see the relationship going well. We would like to have Turkey as in a comfortable relationship with us. Europe feels the same, and certainly all parties have an interest in a stable Turkey. The question, and I think implicit in your question, is my sense that without both carrots and sticks, that kind of healthy relationship isn't possible, and both the Europeans and the United States have been extraordinarily reticent to use sticks of any sort. And I guess my big fear is that having done that and not done enough sort of preliminary signaling, that when we get around to using sticks, they will be too much too fast and precipitate a crisis that nobody wants. So I think the idea of a crisis nobody wants is kind of one of the reasons why I wrote that last paper, because I do see something very informal and ad hoc about the various ways in which security structures, formal and informal, have developed in Turkey since 2013, and particularly since the attempted coup. I don't think that they have guaranteed the security of the regime. I think there's still potential for attempted coups, for assassinations. I think that's one of the reasons why the S-400s are an attractive option for Erdogan. But to go directly to your question, there's a mass mobilization that certainly has echoes of the 70s, but is distinctive in a couple of ways. It's distinctive first because, as you suggested, that mass mobilization is really only on the part of the government. It's not like there's sort of this array. For those of you who don't follow Turkey full time, the 1970s was a period of extensive civil violence between left and right. It was one of the reasons why many people, when the coup d'etat occurred in 1980, welcomed it as a stabilizing factor. But this is while there's more of this informal violence, and I don't need to simply foresee it. We've seen evidence of it. We saw evidence of it during the referendum. We saw evidence of it during the beginning, the breakdown of the peace process. We see a series of incidents, and many of those incidents may only break through to the internet press because there's very little opposition press left in Turkey occasionally. But my sense is that in a crisis, that mass mobilization creates the potential for a much broader, uglier type of violence. And even in a highly contested electoral cycle, like Sonaire, I think that 2018 is a very good year for an election. As far as I can see, there's very little way that Aafrin is a political loser domestically for the foreseeable future. The press is in AKP's hand. The opposition is still sort of finding its feet. The economy seems to be doing well. I think that this is a good time for an election, and I think that that mass mobilization makes it likely that the sorts of attacks on opposition party leaders, those attacks on, certainly HDP, but presumably also potentially E-Party headquarters will occur. And then, if the election comes through as expected, then we're looking at an entirely different type of regime.
Okay, Sonaire.
Just brings us to this debate we had earlier, and Howard's points are excellent to look at what lies ahead for Turkey. And I think the bad news from Turkey is that it's 50-50 split, and the good news is that it's 50-50 split. Meaning Erdogan will never have 80-90% support that he can just say, oh, ignore the rest, they'll go away, I'll brush them under the carpet. It's 40 million people, you can't do that. So Turkey's luck, it looks bad at first because it's completely polarized, but its luck is that neither of these opposing views of society, let's call them Erdoganist and anti-Erdoganist, or secular and conservative and whatever you want to say, neither of them will completely destroy the other, even if they want to eliminate the other side, because geographically, demographically, economically, those three blocks are almost equally large, and sometimes, in fact, the anti-Erdogan bloc is perhaps economically bigger than the pro-Erdogan bloc. But nevertheless, I think the nearly equal size of the blocs politically suggests that going forward, there has to be some sort of social consensus, not because one morning Erdogan will wake up, will have an epiphany, but because he's going to realize that it doesn't matter whether he wins the elections, rigs the outcome. He's going to have this big block of a very large group of Turks who basically don't want to fall under his vision. Gönül mentioned I wrote a new book recently called The New Sultan. I just wanted to plug it shamelessly. One of the arguments I make in this book is that Erdogan is the new, in quotes, of course, Ataturk, right? What's an Ataturk in quotes? It's someone who wants to shape society in his own image, top-down, Jacobin style. That's what Ataturk did. 100 years ago, he shaped Turkey in his own image as a secular Western European place because that's what he believed everybody should become. It worked to an extent, not completely. It failed. Erdogan is now the new Ataturk. He wants to shape Turkey in his own image, using his own values. So, of course, he's not an Ataturk. He doesn't share Ataturk's values, just his methods of top-down social engineering. He wants to use public policy, education policy, state resources to shape Turkey in his own image, which is the opposite of Ataturk. He wants to make Turkey, I would say, socially conservative, politically Islamist, and directionally Middle Eastern. Now, the challenge for him is that Ataturk's Turkey was 13% literate. Most educated Turks supported him. Erdogan's Turkey is 97% literate. As you know from your friends, most educated Turks do not support him. So he's going to have a completely difficult time getting across whether or not he wins the election. So I think at some point he has to realize that this big half of the country won't go away. I recently wrote a piece on that, arguing that maybe, and I agree with Howard, unlike previous Turkish presidents, Erdogan, when he loses elections, is not going to retire to Marmaris and paint. That's what Turkish presidents do. Marmaris is a resort in southern Turkey. It's nice and warm. You buy a house there, you paint. Because he knows that he has stepped on so many toes and demonized so many groups that they'll go after him. So I think one way forward for Turkey is, of course, for this opposition, which is composed of so many disparate groups, to come together. That's a very tall order. And to offer him a deal to say, you know what, whatever happened has happened, moving forward. Maybe that's one way to let Erdogan know that if he loses elections, he can go to Marmaris and paint and nothing will happen. So I still have hope. I'll stay with that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's take another round. The gentleman here. Another question there.
Mustafa Gürbüz, Arab Center, Washington. My question is, if Erdogan wins the election, will he seek normalization in the country, and rather than high military activism, which could be threatening himself in the long run? And what would be, if so, what would be the implications in terms of the Kurdish issue?
Thank you. And another question here.
Bob Hervey, formerly a military attaché in Turkey. 3.5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, 1 million of them perhaps in Istanbul. Erdogan had said just a couple days ago that the Syrian operation will continue until all 3.5 million have been returned to Syria. What does that play in all of the considerations? Secondly, in that regard, is anybody talking to this group? Is there any leadership of these 3.5 million Syrians in Turkey? And is anybody finding out what they're thinking about what's happening in Syria?
Okay. Who would like to?
Well, I can quickly on that. On your very last part of the, are there leaders? I was recently speaking with Nigar Göksel, who you probably all know, who's working this issue very closely. I urge you to look at her work, and she said that's one of the big problems, is that there are no sort of consensus leaders among the Syrian refugee community. Part of that, I think, in the early years was intentional from the AKP standpoint. They didn't really want independent leadership. They didn't want the perception of a Syrian political movement because the refugee issue is so touchy. But I urge you to perhaps even reach out to her. She's Nigar Göksel. She's done the best work in this space, I believe. I don't take Erdogan seriously on his rhetoric that it will continue until they're all home, only because then it will never end. Because it's very, very clear to me that many, if not most of these Syrian refugees will be in Turkey for the foreseeable future and will likely be incorporated into Turkish society. And that is an extremely dicey political issue in Turkey today. I mentioned earlier our polling. The only group with unfavorable ratings close to the United States were the Syrian refugees. There's deep hostility among the Turkish population towards Syrian refugees. People are angry about the visibility in the major cities like Istanbul, as you mentioned. You hear, we did focus groups as well, you hear things that could be right out of Western Europe during the refugee crisis, or the United States during the very hostile campaign in 2016. People saying, I walk around, Fatih, I don't even hear Turkish anymore, all I hear is Arabic, those sorts of sentiments. And they are bubbling up, I think. In the last year, something qualitative has changed on the refugee issue. So that has a lot of implications at the societal level, I think politically. That's why Erdogan is so intent on messaging that this campaign is in part to get the Syrians back to Syria. I think also it holds up the likelihood that the various challenger, 2018 will be defined, I think I said earlier, as sort of this battle for control of the Turkish nationalist right. And Akşener and even Kılıçdaroğlu to some extent are using, I would call them dog whistles, but at times they're pretty explicit, attacks on the refugee question. And that's a serious vulnerability for Erdogan, although his control of the press helps insulate him from it. On the normalization question, and I'll stop. I don't personally see it. Maybe if he won the election and he feels, okay, I've got 5 years now, I want to lower tensions, but there's so much water under the bridge. There's so much blood spilled, really, is the issue. And who are his interlocutors on the Kurdish side? He's locked up the HDP leaders. He's completely conflated the Kurdish political movement with the PKK, who are terrorists. So who does he talk to now? The terrorists? He's boxed himself into a corner whereby even if he doesn't feel the need to reach out to the nationalist constituency in the wake of an electoral victory, he's backed himself into a rhetorical corner. I don't see a way out, which is, of course, very unfortunate for all parties involved.
So I'll just go to the moderation issue, which I think has been discussed maybe since 2007, 2008, which is to say that there's a lot of people who've been waiting for Erdogan to get enough and to sort of normalize. And I don't think it's baseless. Erdogan has changed course on both foreign policy issues and on domestic issues. There was a massive crackdown at the KCK, and then he turned around and restarted the peace process. But when he's done so on foreign policy, it's been because he was faced with hard, unavoidable facts that he had to address. And when he's done so domestically, it's been done for electoral advantage. He turned against the Kurds when he needed an alliance with the MHP. He moved towards them when that seemed like a likelier path. But at its core, I think that in both cases, I think that Erdogan is a belief-based leader. Yes, he's capable of he makes rational decisions, but he makes rational decisions through powerful senses of right and wrong. I don't think that he's simply instrumental. And maybe one of my big frustrations when I come to DC is how many people read his actions as merely instrumental. Oh, it's for domestic purposes. Oh, it's because he's trying to get leverage. I think he does a lot of things because he thinks it's right. And I think that makes him a less predictable interlocutor for foreign affairs. And I think it makes our waiting for moderation a little bit like waiting for Godot. Because at its core, this is, yes, there's 50% of the country who's unhappy with them, but there's lots of authoritarian regimes who have large numbers of people who are unhappy with them. They don't need to be happy, they need to acquiesce. My concern with Erdogan and why I think he's distinctive from many authoritarian leaders with whom the United States has worked is that he does have that social engineering, Turkist element to him. He wants to remake Turkish society, and we might disagree somewhat on the terms of that remaking, but he has a sense of right and wrong, both domestically, where he has been uncompromising in his pursuit of enemies, and in foreign policy, where he's taken a lot of actions that were based not on a narrow calculation of what's in Turkey's best interest, but because he thought it was the right thing to do. And sometimes that works out very well for him, Jerusalem, and sometimes it doesn't, Syria. I think that we should not expect, it's possible, but I wouldn't expect it, that sense that domestic enemies must be crushed. The AKP tent could be much bigger. He's chosen to make it what it is. The conflicts, yes, Europe and the United States want a stable and friendly Turkey, and Turkey, in a sense, wants those things too. But I don't, in any particular conflict, I don't think that we can necessarily predict Erdogan's response. And I'll give one quick example. From what we can tell, Treasury and Halkbank are negotiating in good faith over the fines that will be accrued. And from what we can tell from the ministers, they're willing to let the process move forward. Despite all that, I don't know in the end what President Erdogan's going to do, and whether he's going to allow Halkbank to pay, whether he decides we need to have some reciprocity here, we're going to pursue American banks for something else, whether the sense in foreign policy that Turkey must be treated as an equal, and his fundamental belief that the Halkbank prosecution represents an attack on Turkish sovereignty means that while the rational thing to do is to bite the bullet, whether it's 6 billion or 11 billion or whatever it is, the rational choice is to bite the bullet. But there's also a question of right and wrong. And I think that Erdogan, that's a hard bullet for Erdogan to bite, because I think that in the end, he thinks it's fundamentally wrong. And both domestically and in foreign policy, I think that mitigates against moderation.
Also, on our final points.
Quickly jump in on the Syrian refugees and then also on the Kurdish issue and Erdogan's future. We might think Turkey and Syria, they're neighbors, Turkish and Arabic, how different could they be? I can't tell you how many times people ask me if I speak Arabic, to which I say, no, do you speak Latin? Differences between Turks and their neighbors to the south are significant, political, cultural, and I think the refugee issue, I agree with Max, has created resentment, not unsimilar to what you saw in Germany and Western Europe in 2015, from a sense of economic competition among working classes to a sense of, in quotes, cultural invasion among middle classes. And the opposition, I think, will use both in the forthcoming elections. And the question is how successfully Turkey integrates the Syrians to 3.5 million. It's a fairly big number. It's a dynamic economy. And I think it's pretty upward mobile as a society. So chances for serious integration are pretty significant. Granted that they all learn Turkish, so someone has to teach them Turkish. But at the same time, I think one of the reasons why Turkey wants to take part of Afrin is because it wants to use that, as it did in Jarablus earlier, part of Syria that it took, to repatriate some of the refugees. I know they've probably relocated nearly 500,000 to Jarablus, so perhaps a similar number to Afrin. So maybe that's also part of Turkey's vision. On the Kurdish issue, I think, and whether Erdogan can pivot again, I believe, as I wrote in the New Sultan, that Erdogan's brand as a politician is that he's the authoritarian underdog, meaning there's a conspiracy against him, and it's useful that sometimes there are actual conspiracies, such as the coup, the nefarious coup. And so he's justified to crack down on his opposition because they're about to get him. And then he's used strong economic growth, an amazing success story under him to build a base, as well as a message of social conservatism. That is how Erdogan has built a winning majority over and over. But he's also, because he faces so many opposition groups, he's been very tactical. He's never gone after the entire opposition. He's always divided. So he will target one opposition group, make alliances with the others, and go after this group. Once he has defeated the said opposition group, he'll move on to the next one, make another broad alliance, bring the former adversaries in, and then continue. He did this against secularists in the last decade. Masterfully, it worked. When he went after secularists, the leftists, the liberals, the Kurdish nationalists came on board. He went after the liberals, Kurdish nationalists, told by their leadership to stay out, did so from the Gezi Park rallies. And of course, in the end, when he went after the Gülen movement, which is a big part and parcel of Erdogan's power grab in Turkey, nobody was there to help them because everybody was basically saying, you deserve it. So his strategy over the time has been to demonize one group in his opposition while reaching out to others in the opposition. And now he's targeting Kurdish nationalists. And I could believe that if Erdogan wins the elections, he might have another pivot, turn back. The person whose name we haven't pronounced in this room so far is Öcalan, the founding leader of PKK, in jail, cultish influence over the PKK. We discussed YPG and PKK ties. If anybody has their doubts that YPG is PKK, you can basically tell them whoever worships Öcalan is PKK, and that's what YPG does in Syria. Part of the reason I think why Rojava is in trouble is because all these inhabitants of this YPG-run entity, Kurd, Arab, Christian, are being taught Öcalanism, an ideology in school. So anyhow, in Turkey, Öcalan's appeal, we think, is still pretty significant over the Kurdish nationalist base. He's in jail on this island in the middle of Sea of Marmara, completely isolated. It's where the Byzantine emperors sent their fallen princesses, so you get the idea of being isolated. He hasn't been able to speak. He's completely incommunicado. There's a reason. I think Erdogan will let him speak when he is ready to make his pivot. The question is, will the Kurdish movement listen to Öcalan at this stage? What will he say? I have a feeling, because of his cultish appeal over the Kurdish nationalist movement, that they might, and that might allow Erdogan to make a pivot. The question is, if he's making peace with Kurdish nationalists, after which group does he decide to go at that stage? Who becomes the next demonized target? Anyhow, last point. I think that sometimes Erdogan regrets his decision to switch to executive-style presidency. Because in the good old days, he could always win 40%. And in a multi-party democracy, 40%, because there are so many parties and there's a high electoral threshold, 10%, parties which fail the threshold cannot get into the parliament. The first party gets their seats. AKP always ends up with more seats than its share in the vote. With 40%, he could always have strong legislative majorities and form government. Now he has to win 50. And he hasn't really been able to do that with allegations of voter fraud in the referendum, fair and square. And of course, the campaign season was completely unfair, documented by OSCE. So I think sometimes he maybe regrets it and says, I wish I could go back to the good old days when I was not executive-style president. But it's too late for that. So, which is why I think the next round of elections are really interesting, because that's going to be his real test of getting to 50%. And I believe, despite everything, we might conclude from this discussion on Turkey that it still remains a very diverse and pluralistic society. And we saw this was, I think, pretty vivid in the run-up to referendum. Despite the fact it was an unfair campaign season, he was still able to get only 50%. So I think the jury's still out on his ability to muster a strong electoral victory. And but I would say he's a man for all seasons. Definitely expect him to pivot around, and I'll stop here, I think.
Can I ask him a question? So now,
Very briefly.
it will be brief.
Is it about the new Sultan?
It'll be about the election. So let's imagine that despite the despite the media support, despite the institutional support, as a practical matter, if there were a real count, that Erdogan gets 45% of the presidential vote, he goes home?
If this is the outcome of the election, then we'd probably try to postpone the elections, which we have seen before, repeat elections, which we have seen before. So on that, I go with his unpredictability, of course, yeah.
Okay, well, I know you all look confused after, after the discussion, but thank you so much. This was a fascinating discussion, and I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. Thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking our panelists.